The sound a man makes as he burns is a symphony of horror. It begins with a sharp crackle as the skin blisters and splits, followed by a low, persistent hiss like water on hot iron. Then comes the scream, a sound so primal it seems to tear a hole in the fabric of the world. This was the music that filled the town square of Rouen in 1431, according to one witness who recorded the event. The man at the center of the flames was not a noble, not a soldier captured in battle, nor a heretic condemned by the church. He was a peasant, and his crime was telling a joke. The offense was a fleeting moment of levity in a dimly lit tavern, a few words, a shared laugh, a king's dignity momentarily punctured. The punishment was absolute, death by fire. Not a clean death, not a swift one, but a slow, agonizing spectacle designed for maximum humiliation and public consumption. His name is a ghost in the annals of history, deliberately scrubbed from the records. His transgression was not an act of armed rebellion or a conspiracy of poison. It was a rebellion of the tongue, and in a kingdom where the king's authority was as fragile as it was absolute, mocking the crown was tantamount to defying God himself. Killing him was not enough. He had to be obliterated, his very existence turned into a cautionary tale written in smoke and ash. For the monarchs of this era understood a fundamental principle of power that political theorists would later name, narrative is a weapon. You can lose a battle, you can replace a general, but a joke that spreads from market to market, from village to village, is an insurgency that no army can quell. The fire, therefore, was not merely an instrument of execution, it was a tool of psychological warfare, intended to cauterize the very thought of dissent from the collective memory of the populace. He was tied to a stake in the very square where merchants sold their wares and children played. The local priests stood by, their silence a form of consent. The air grew thick with the ghastly, sweet smell of his burning flesh. And in a distant castle, a king did not rejoice, for this was not an act of passion. It was an act of policy. The peasants' screams eventually subsided into gasps, then silence. When the sun set, all that was left was a pile of embers and a chilling, unspoken command: see nothing. Say nothing. Forget you have a voice. This is not a grand tale of a fallen queen or a treacherous prince. It is the intimate story of a jest and the terrifying consequences when laughter is declared treason. The most telling detail is that history has swallowed his name. All we possess are fragments, a notation in a tax ledger, a passing mention in a bishop's correspondence referring to a man of the lowest estate punished for grave irreverence. The most vivid account comes from a traveling chronicler who documented the execution with gut-wrenching detail but never bothered to ask for the peasant's name. Perhaps he was called Jean, a name as common as the dirt on the roads of 15th-century France. Jean of Rouen, Jean the carpenter, Jean the fool. A man with no land, no title, no legacy to shield him, nothing but a voice. And one fateful evening, that voice carried too far. He would have been born into a world of relentless suffering. His childhood would have been set against the backdrop of the 100 Years' War, a conflict that had bled France for generations, turning fertile fields into barren wastelands and leaving towns smoldering in ruins. He lived under the reign of Charles VII, a monarch derisively called the King of Bourges, because his control barely extended beyond a small sliver of his supposed kingdom. His claim to the throne was tenuous, his legitimacy had been challenged by his own family, and his paranoia grew with every whispered rumor from the provinces. In such a volatile climate, the line between a loyal subject and a traitor was determined by who was listening. Jean was no revolutionary, he possessed no grand political ideology. His only asset was a wit as sharp as a blade. In his village, he was the man who could wring laughter from the bleakest of realities, poking fun at the parish priest, the pompous tax collector, and, on occasion, the distant, almost mythical figure of the king. The joke that sealed his fate is lost to us. Some whispered that he had mimicked the king's rumored limp, stumbling theatrically across the tavern's dirt floor to the delight of his friends. Others believed he made a bawdy remark about the queen and her rumored indiscretions. Another version claims it was a more direct and dangerous jest, a simple, cutting phrase about the king's crown being made of something other than gold. It might not have even been Jean who said it first, but he was the one whose laughter was loudest, the one who was overheard by the wrong person. The specifics of the joke are irrelevant. What mattered was what it symbolized. A peasant's words were meant to be humble, grateful, and fearful. Jean's words, however, had teeth. And in a monarchy held together by the twin pillars of ceremony and fear, a single joke could send tremors all the way to the throne. The king's men did not come for him right away. That was not the method. First, the whispers began to circulate. Then, a visit from the local priest, his questions veiled but pointed. Weeks passed, long enough for a false sense of security to settle in. Then came the inevitable, heavy knock on the door in the dead of night. He was taken without a fight. There was no point. As he knew, and as every villager knew, once the crown accused you of mockery, you were already a dead man. And so, a man armed with nothing but his own voice became an enemy of the state, pursued by the full, terrifying machinery of royal power. He was targeted not for being a threat, but because he reminded others that the emperor, indeed, had no clothes. To comprehend why a joke could cost a man his life, one must first understand the world that Jean inhabited, a world where words were not merely sounds, but forces capable of building or shattering power. 15th century France was a kingdom balanced on a knife's edge, still reeling from the generational trauma of the Black Death and the ceaseless 100 Years' War. King Charles VII's authority was a fragile construct, built on the rickety foundation of the doctrine of the divine right of kings. This was not just a religious tenet, it was the central pillar of state security. The idea that the king was God's chosen representative on earth had to be protected at all costs, for if that myth crumbled, the entire monarchy might fall with it. This protection was enforced not primarily by armies, but by a carefully cultivated atmosphere of fear, fear of speaking out, fear of questioning, and especially, fear of laughing at the man whose image was presented as sacred. The legal instrument for this enforcement was the crime of lèse-majesté, literally, injured majesty. It was not a crime against a person, but against the very concept of monarchy. The charge was intentionally vague and terrifyingly elastic. It could encompass anything from direct criticism of a royal decree to mocking the king's appearance, or even failing to display sufficient reverence. A careless comment in a marketplace could be reported by a rival. A servant might betray a master over a joke told in private. The system thrived on suspicion, and truth was a malleable concept. Under the law of the monarchy, the truth was not what had objectively happened, the truth was whatever the king declared it to be. In this world, even your silence could be interpreted as dissent. But laughter, unfiltered, irreverent laughter, was a confession of treason. Jean's world was one of performance. The king's power was a spectacle, reinforced daily through symbols and rituals. His likeness was stitched into every banner and carved into every church pulpit. From childhood, subjects were conditioned to kneel when his name was spoken and avert their eyes when his procession passed. This reverence was not simply requested, it was policed by a sprawling network of spies. Priests, judges, tax collectors, and even common tavern keepers were tasked with listening for the slightest hint of discontent. Your home was your sanctuary, but the moment your words crossed your threshold and entered the public ear, they became the king's property. Punishment, like power, was a public performance. An execution for theft was a lesson about property. An execution for heresy was a lesson about God. But an execution for speech was a lesson about obedience itself. It wasn't enough to silence the offender, the crowd had to witness the silencing, to have the spectacle of suffering seared into their minds. Jean's fate was sealed the instant the joke left his lips. The only remaining question was how public, how brutal, and how memorable his end would be. His journey into darkness began in a cell. He was taken not to a simple jail, but to a place designed to unmake a man. The trial was a formality that would come later. First came the ritual of deconstruction. He was thrown into a stone chamber beneath the magistrate's court, a space so damp the walls wept and so small he could not fully stand. Time was stolen from him. There were no windows, no clocks, only the faint sliver of light that bled through a crack in the ceiling. His guards worked in shifts to deny him sleep, their constant banging on the door and shouting of scripture in a language he couldn't comprehend serving as a relentless assault on his sanity. Days and nights blurred into a seamless nightmare of exhaustion and confusion. Hooded figures would appear and demand answers to the same questions, over and over. Who else was in on the joke? Who were your co-conspirators? Did a nobleman pay you to say it? He insisted it was just a jest, the ramblings of a drunk. But they were not interested in his truth, they were interested in crafting a confession that served their narrative. While formal torture was technically regulated, they had other methods. They starved him for days, then offered him bread teeming with mold. They forced him to stand naked in the freezing cellar, his body trembling uncontrollably. They whispered lurid tales of other traitors who had met their end in the fire, forcing him to imagine the sound of his own skin crackling. His mind, stretched to its breaking point, began to fray. He wept, he begged for a quick death, he even offered to maim himself if it would end the torment. His interrogators would listen patiently, thank him for his cooperation, and then demand more names. This wasn't punishment, it was the meticulous preparation of a prop for a play. By the time they dragged him into the courtroom, he was a hollowed-out shell, a lesson ready to be taught. The trial was over in minutes. The hall was stark, a magistrate on a raised platform, a few clerks, and a handful of carefully chosen officials to bear witness. Jean stood before them, barefoot and skeletal, the bruises on his wrists a testament to his ordeal. The charges were read aloud in booming, elaborate language, accusing him of sedition, sacrilege, and inciting public disdain for the divine institution of the crown. The grand words hung in the air, a stark contrast to the simple, crude joke that had brought him here. He tried to speak, perhaps to explain that it was a moment of foolishness, not malice. But his voice was a dry rasp, and no one met his gaze. The magistrate asked a single question: did he deny speaking the words? Jean paused, the last flicker of his former self rising. I spoke in jest, he whispered. It was only a joke. That was all the confession they needed. The verdict was delivered without a moment of deliberation. Death by fire. Not hanging, reserved for common thieves, nor the sword, the privilege of the nobility. Fire, because fire consumes, because fire purifies, and because fire turns a man's death into a lingering, unforgettable sermon. They started building his pyre at sunrise. The act of execution was a meticulous craft, a piece of theater where every element was symbolic. The platform rose in the center of the town square, the same ground where farmers sold their produce and lovers met. Now, this heart of the community was being transformed into an altar for an execution, a furnace designed to forge fear. Jean could hear the construction from his cell across the square, the rhythmic hammering, the splintering of wood, the shouts of the guards. The sounds were a deliberate part of his final torment, a reminder that his death was not his own, it was a state-sponsored performance. By noon, a diverse crowd had filled the square. It was a cross-section of society, peasants with hardened faces, merchants in their fine wools, stoic soldiers off duty, and even curious nobles who had traveled to witness the spectacle. The atmosphere was not one of mourning, but of tense, morbid anticipation. It was a festival of fear, and Jean, starved and broken, was to be the guest of honor. When the guards finally dragged him into the daylight, a hush fell over the crowd. It was not a silence of sympathy, but of cold, calculating observation. This was the moment of collective understanding. One of them was about to be unmade, not just in body, but in spirit, as a warning to all. They bound him to the central post, his arms wrenched behind him. His body, ravaged by starvation, sagged against the wood. A soldier cinched the ropes tighter, not out of cruelty, but to ensure the show wouldn't end prematurely. The magistrate then ascended the platform, his movements practiced and detached. He unrolled a scroll and read the sentence in a loud, clear voice, his words directed not at the condemned man, who stared blankly at the ground, but at the silent, watching sea of faces. "Let this man serve as a lesson," he boomed. "That the tongue that dares to mock the crown will meet its end in the cleansing fire. Let no man, however low, imagine himself above the majesty of God's anointed king." There was no gasp from the crowd, only the heavy, suffocating silence. Then, a guard stepped forward with a lit torch. The flame met the pitch-soaked kindling with an eager hiss. For a moment, there was only a whisper of fire, then a crackle, and then a sudden, violent roar as the pyre ignited. The heat hit Gene first, and he flinched. The fire licked at his feet, consuming the worn leather of his shoes, then the cloth of his trousers, then his skin. A scream tore from his throat, a raw, inhuman sound of pure agony that shot through the smoke and scattered the birds from the rooftops. His body convulsed against the ropes, muscles seizing in a desperate, futile rebellion. The flames climbed relentlessly, swallowing his legs, his torso, his arms. The smell that filled the square was unforgettable, the sickeningly sweet odor of burning human fat. A few people in the front vomited, others turned away, only to be drawn back by the horrific spectacle. His screams continued for what felt like an eternity before dissolving into choked, gurgling noises as the fire engulfed his neck and face. Finally, there was a sickening pop as his skull fractured in the intense heat. The fire was not extinguished. It was allowed to burn for hours, until nothing remained but charred wood and blackened bones. The order was absolute, he was to be erased. By sunset, a grim quiet had settled over the square. The ashes and bone fragments were shoveled into a cart, hauled outside the town walls, and unceremoniously dumped into an unmarked pit for criminals and plague victims. There would be no grave, no marker, no prayer to sanctify his passing. His name was officially expunged from the village registry. His meager possessions, a few tools, a single change of clothes, were confiscated by the crown. His family, if he had one, vanished from all records, their existence scrubbed clean to prevent any legacy of grief or martyrdom. To mourn him was to become an accomplice. And yet, the story did not end there. The monarchy's attempt to weaponize his death had an unintended consequence. Instead of terrorizing the people into submission, it planted a seed of deep and bitter resentment. They did not forget Gene, they simply learned to speak of him in code. His tale became a hushed warning passed from parent to child, not about the dangers of treason, but about the terrifying cruelty of unchecked power. "Hold your tongue," they would whisper, "or the fire will find you as it found the jester." He was supposed to be a symbol of royal authority. Instead, he became a ghost that haunted it, a shadow of a man who, with nothing more than a joke, had revealed the paranoid, violent heart of the thing that ruled them. The official histories never mentioned him again, but in the margins of court ledgers and the private diaries of monks, a few lines survived. Centuries later, these fragments were all that was left, proving that while you can burn a man, you cannot burn his story. History, no matter how brutally suppressed, always finds a crack to seep through.